let me tell you, I guess, about, let me tell you about when I went to Africa. How about that? I'll show some pictures of this when when I have time here. Well, when I upload this, I'll upload some pictures of me in Africa. And I'll upload a song that I wrote in Africa. I feel very important to remember that I was a songwriter at one time. I still could be, I suppose. Perhaps I will again in the future one day. At heart, I am, and I used to write elaborate songs, not recorded super well because of the technology that was available at the time, which was primarily like cassette tape, ancient. I don't even know if you'll know what the heck that is. But nonetheless, I recorded a song about my time in Africa. And so I guess I'll tell you a little bit about that. In 1994, this is before speed, drugs, any of that. This is before I knew your mom by a few years. I had been in the Bay Area as a musician, trying to make it in music. And through a series of unfortunate circumstances, which I may or may not have already shared with you, I'm not sure, I was forced to move back to Modesto from the Bay Area. And it was very demoralizing. Didn't really know what to do. I was still doing music, but it was the same band I'd been with in the Bay Area, the two Matts, my best friends in this universe. But things just had kind of soured, and it wasn't going the same as it had before. And I was still writing music on my own, but I was floundering. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what I wanted to do. And so I started going back to school, sort of see if I could figure out what I was interested in. I was taking things that I liked, philosophy classes, sociology classes, music classes. One of the classes I took was African American Studies. And because I'd always been fascinated with African American culture, and there was still such a divide, and it still is, between whites and blacks, and I hated that about it. I understood it to a degree, but not as much as I came to realize it when I took that class. I didn't understand as much as I thought I had, and I really yearned to connect with people of African American descent. You know, I felt there's some sense of white liberal guilt, probably, of, you know, sort of feeling bad for what my ancestors have done, or rather wanting to do my part to correct that, and wanting to get to know people and for them to get to know me, and to try to participate in a solution where, you know, we can come together and understand each other. And so my sort of first step in that direction was this African American Studies class. Mrs. Philpotts, she taught it. And I learned a lot. I learned a lot about my own biases, which I hadn't really thought that I had in certain ways. I learned ways in which I actually was pretty enlightened, that I was grateful to realize I actually am enlightened comparatively to other white kids my age in some ways. I learned a lot about the unknown, unseen, invisible, patronizing attitude that a lot of whites could have with African Americans, and a lot about their history. And I wanted to go deeper than that. And Mrs. Philpotts, God bless her, awesome African American woman who taught that class, handed out flyers for Operation Crossroads Africa. And Operation Crossroads Africa is an entity which the Peace Corps was founded or modeled after. Been around since 1940 something, or for a long time, 1950s. Non-religious humanitarian organization focused on community improvement in Africa, and bridging those gaps, cultural gaps, between not just whites and blacks, but African Americans and Africans. And so it was something finally that motivated me and excited me after not having anything excite me for a while prior to that. I'd really been in the doldrums. And I was a hippie too. I was smoking a lot of weed. That was the weed days for me, but I had already been smoking weed for a while. And I was getting on the other side of that to the kind of like, it was no longer like, whoa. It was more like, the smoke, and I don't, you know, it's just kind of getting like thick and heavy. My head was not clear and I was dirty all the time. And this was the first thing that kind of excited me and perked me up. And so I filled out an application for it and I got accepted. And I got assigned to the Gambia team, the Gambia group that was going to go to Gambia. And I was so stoked, so stoked. This was going to be my first time out of the country, with the exception of Canada, which does not count. This is going to be my first time on a plane, everything. Or on a big plane. I'd been on a 4-seater once before. So I was stoked. So I got ready for the summer of '94, flew out to New York City. First time I was ever in New York City. And first and only time, still to this day. I mean, I think I've been on layovers there maybe since, but met my compatriots in New York City, which I'll post a picture. We were such a diverse group of people. There was Luke and Patty from West Point. They were West Point cadets, military. On their apparently West Point would like to have their cadets on one of the summers go to a foreign country as a civilian to experience other countries. But these people were on the fast track to becoming military officers. You don't get into West Point by nothing. That's a difficult thing to do. So there's Luke and Patty from West Point, who I thought I would have nothing in common with. Sharon was a school teacher from Oklahoma. She was our team leader. There was, I can't remember her name, a gal from she's of Filipino descent, who was a student to become, I think she was a nursing student. There was Nigel, an African-American Rastafari, real tall guy from Brooklyn, who was a union organizer, who also smoked weed, a gang of weed. I thought he and I would get along great. There were several other people that I feel bad because I can't remember their names right now. Those were certainly the folks who were played a most significant impact on my time there. So we got to know each other in New York City. We went out on New York City. I went out with Luke and Patty and actually started to realize that I liked them. And we went to Times Square, and I promptly helped some street hustler convince Luke to play a 3-card Monte shell game, and I was egging him on, going like, yeah, put the money down, you can do this. I don't know why. He lost like $60 in like 5 minutes or something. It was terrible. I stood at the foot of the Twin Towers before they came down, which was a pretty amazing experience. They were so tall, they looked like they curved. I mean, they literally looked like they curved. The event horizon was so far away. And we prepared. We went through things about the stages you're going to go through of cultural acclimation and all this stuff. So we get on a plane. It was one of those 2-story planes. That's a 7-something. I don't know if it's the 747 or the spiral staircase and everything. Flew off. And Matt Salas, my brother, one of your god Matts, he made a mixtape, and he sort of calculated when I should listen to it. You know, it was like a 2-hour-long mixtape or whatever, and I timed it just for the landing. When we came in, timed it perfectly. It was an amazing mixtape. The world was so full of hope. The O.J. Simpson trial was going on at the time in America, and there's such racial divide. I think maybe that's part of why I went, actually, now that I think about it, is because there was such a racially divided situation going on. The Rodney King riots had happened not that long ago. So much interracial violence. Gangster rap was happening. I loved rap. I loved Tupac. So there was all this stuff, and as I landed in Gambia, we landed just as the sun was setting in Gambia, West Africa, and I was so full of hope and just awe and just inspired. And so got off the plane, got all of our stuff, got into a cab, a taxi cab. There were like what? There were 8 of us, 10 of us. We went down to the city center, central city. Actually, we landed in Senegal. Thank you. We landed in Senegal, Dakar, Senegal, the biggest city in West Africa. It is New York City of Africa. It's huge. There's nothing Africa about it other than it's wall-to-wall black people, right? But I mean, it's a major city with all the pestilence and, you know, litter and garbage and all that. And we found our way through the city to where this place in the city center where you could, actually we had to stay in the airport for hours. We didn't get into a cab, and I don't remember what the delay was, but we got into a cab in the early morning hours. It took us to the center of Dakar. As the sun was rising, we got into a car, all 10 of us, like a Toyota Camry. We were in there like sardines to prepare for a 14-hour drive. By the way, it was a 14-hour flight across the Atlantic, and now a 14-hour drive down to Gambia. And as we drove down there, the culture shock really set in. That's where the culture shock really kicked in, because we were driving through sub-Saharan Africa, the desert, sub-Saharan. This was not jungles and mangoes like I was expecting to see in Gambia, and I did end up seeing that, but I didn't realize this vast stretch of wasteland of sub-Saharan parched earth, sparsely, you know, vegetated yet populated landscape that we had to go down. You'd come across, there'd be nothing for hours, and then all of a sudden you come across a little village of like wooden huts. It would be like a blip, and then it would be gone. It'd be like, where do they even get their water, let alone eat? And then you'd come to some sort of like gas station, like there'd be like these fueling stations, which were kind of in the middle of nowhere, but all the people from the villages and stuff, the kids in particular, would come around that area because that's where tourists or just people from elsewhere would come through. You know, you're not driving through that area if you live there. You know, mostly you're somebody from somewhere else. And so all these little kids would swarm the car and ask for candy, and they'd say two bob. Two bob was the word for white. And they were just so poor. They were so broke. There were flies landing on them and shit, and it was overwhelming. And but we kept going, and eventually, as the sun started to set, we got into Gambia, and the landscape started to change, and we got onto we got to the Gambian River. We had to cross the Gambian River. So Senegal is a big country, and in the middle of Senegal is a little pie-sliced sliver of a country called Gambia. And in the middle of that is the Gambian River, which bisects and separates the two sides of Gambia. And the Gambian River is the largest river from the ocean to the inland of Africa on the west coast of Africa. So major ships can go down there a ways, right? So from one side of the Gambian River, you could barely see the other side of the Gambian River. And we had to wait for a barge. And it was getting dark now. And I was exhausted, and we were all exhausted. Hot? Jesus. The heat in Gambia, I've never been somewhere where it could rain and be 100 degrees. And it would literally do that. It would be like raining and hot. So the humidity was off the chain. One of the first things I experienced as we got on the barge there was somebody trying to pick my pocket. Luckily, I was hip to that scene. I had my money in a little traveler thing around my neck. And but I mean, it makes sense in retrospect. These people were broke. So we got into Gambia. We went and had some dinner, and we met our counterparts. And basically, for each one of us, we had a counterpart our same age, our same gender, and we traveled in these big groups, right? So once I got into Gambia, I think we stayed in somebody's house that night because we've been traveling for like 2 days, basically. And then the next morning, we all drove in another little car to Metakesa, which was the little village that we were going to be at. And what our job there was to build a community center for all, for several villages, Metakesa and several other villages, to combine and join together and start to create an infrastructure. We were going to build a building where they could come together and start to trade and become an economic unit as this area was developing. And we came into Metakesa, and this was finally the Africa I was thinking I would see, which was deep in the jungle. Just lush vegetation, green, monkeys running around, mangoes, literally, I mean, mangoes that were juicier and sweeter than anything you'll ever get in America, and they'd be the size of your freaking head. Just, they're just falling off the trees. And we got into the village center of Metakesa to a big hoopla. The villagers came out, and they took us to the village center, and there was the chief, all the villagers. I mean, I would say, I don't know, maybe a couple hundred people probably lived there, give or take, in that village. And we met the village chief, but he was losing his mind because he was like 105 years old. So he was kind of there in name only. Everybody gave him deference and reverence, but it was one of his sons who was actually speaking and welcoming us. They wheeled out 2 wheelbarrows full of mangoes, and we just started chowing down on those. And they welcomed us all, and they gave a very special welcome to the African Americans. Andrea, she was another gal, African American gal, sociology student, I think, one of these historic African black colleges, you know, like in Atlanta or somewhere. They welcomed us all, but they in particular welcomed the African Americans among us back home, welcome home, basically, to them. And that was emotional for all of us, but particularly emotional for the African Americans in my group. And it was emotional for me just to see how emotional it was for them, because of, in the way it was put, I mean, because of being ripped, you know, out of their, you know, environment, you know, and their families taken away, and all the trauma, the psychic trauma that caused. And it was really very meaningful and emotional to the African Americans in my group. And then a goat came out. Then they brought a goat. And we have an interpreter, but the interpreter hasn't interpreted anything yet. I see the goat. I'm like, oh, shit. And I look at I think the Filipino gal looked at me, and we looked at it, like, what's happening here? And sure enough, the goat is the sacrifice that they are going to kill and that we are going to dine on that night. And so without even like a warning, pull a goat's horns back and just cut its neck right in front of us. And I'm flipping out because I've never seen that before. And I love animals, you know, and I'm not yet hip to the disconnect between loving animals and eating burgers. And that was one of the first things that really caused me to start looking at that. I still eat burgers. And I would like very much to stop one of these days. It's something that's recently become a thing for me again. But prior to seeing that, there'd been a total disconnect. I hadn't even thought about it at all. And seeing this, it was very efficient and brutal and quick, and not violent, but quick and efficient. They sliced his neck, held his neck back so it would bleed out faster. And it was very upsetting to me, and I wasn't going to eat it at first. And then I realized if I don't eat it, it's an insult to them, because they don't have goats dripping off the trees. This is a major sacrifice for this village to be giving up this goat just in our honor. So A, it would be insult, and B, it would be disrespectful to the goat, man. You're already dead. If I'm not going to eat you, what was that for? If I'm not going to nourish myself, then what was that sacrifice for? And so I got over that, but I had to process that for a few days. And that night we dined together. And the way they eat in Gambia at that time is the big, huge, like circular plate. First off, everything in Gambia is peanut based because they have a ton of peanuts. And so it's peanut oil, sweet peanut oil, sour peanut oil, and tons of rice. So it'd be rice, this huge communal dish with rice, and then some sort of root, potatoes, or whatever other roots they had, and then goat meat, and then this peanut sauce all over it, right? And the thing is, you sit around this communal table and you use your hand, you eat with your hand, and you get your whatever, wherever you're sitting, that's your little pie slice. You eat that pie slice. And so I sat there and I started to reach in and eat. I'm left-handed, so I start to reach in with my left hand. Everybody freaks out because over there, your left hand is your poopy hand. Here's the deal: no toilets, no toilet paper. No, what there is a hole in the ground that you shit in. And there's a little thing you can hold on to so while you're squatting so you don't fall, but you shit in the hole. And then you douse your bottom with water. Or if you're a white person visiting, you bring toilet paper with you. And but your left hand is your business hand down there as far as they were concerned. And so I learned how to be ambidextrous over there and eat with my right hand. And so as that was interesting to me. And later that night, I went and hung out with Nigel. Came and got me, and because we, you know, he knew that I liked smoking weed too, and we went and hung out with some of the brothers, okay, in one of the, you know, one of their huts, one of their little buildings, and I smoked my first African joint, which was rolled very differently. It was like a cone, not a joint, and I got really high, too high. Felt really weird being like this sort of skinny hippie white guy sitting around. I mean, there was no such thing as a fat man in rural Gambia. In the big cities, the politicians, sure. But out there, man, they all had abs. They were all cut. They were all big. And just because of the nature of the land and the work. And so they were all farmers. And so it got really weird. And for me, it got even weirder when we were then informed that there was actually a celebratory dance for us that night, which nobody had informed me before I smoked weed. I sometimes wonder if it was a practical joke. And so everybody was now down. It's after dark. There's a big bonfire. Everybody's down there, and you're all supposed to dance. And the thing about it is you're supposed to dance. You come out in the circle yourself, and you dance and express yourself and introduce yourself. And that's kind of the, this is so-and-so. This is how he is. This is his energy. I was so blazed. It was all bad. So time went on. We hung out there. There was a village monkey. They kept, this is totally cruel, but there was a village monkey that they kept chained up, and they would dress it in little clothes, and every once in a while they'd let it off the hook so that the kids could chase it around, which was a big fun activity. And amusing to watch, and also probably pretty terrible. But I started to make friends there. I started to get to know people. We toured the school system. I got close with our counterparts there. You know, there was a tea ceremony we would do every single night where part of the whole thing, it was, they called it gunpowder. It was tea from China. It was so caffeinated. And it was this process of taking like 2 shot glasses and a pot of tea, and you would steep the tea forever. There's a whole way of doing this. And you'd just be talking, conversing. And then you take the tea and you pour it back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. The person who'd be brewing it. And it was not a rushed process. It was all part of hanging out. But over the course of the night, you would get so geetered up on caffeine because it was just so dense that you would just stay up all night. And that's where I really started to bond with our African counterparts there. There were insects the size of hot dogs slapping me in the back of my head because of the lamp, you know, the fire and the lanterns and stuff. I mean, these were jungle insects. So, you know, later on in the experience, we realized that the kids there who I fell in love with kids for the first time in my life because of Gambia. I'd never liked kids before then. And these kids were just so beautiful. and so unguarded and amazing that I just couldn't help it. Plus, there were a ton of them. They were everywhere. So I really fell in love with kids during that time. And we learned that their schooling wasn't mandatory, and it wasn't paid for. And if you couldn't go to school, then your prospects for the future were slim. And so we decided that we wanted to not just build this building that we were started to build. We started it when we made that building brick by brick. We would make each brick. We each spent $3,000 to go over there to buy the materials to build this building, which was the main thing we were doing. So brick by brick, we made this building and the foundation. And I knew nothing about any of that prior to that. And so we'd be doing that by day. We'd be hanging out, drinking tea by night, meeting the kids. There was a dog called Henry that we adopted that the villagers, we later found out they weren't happy about that because they didn't have the same relationship with dogs as we do in America. And so for us, it was our little village dog, Henry. For them, it was a nuisance because this was a dog that was just cruising through, and now it's going to be there expecting food all the time. But they hung out with the dog too. I think they secretly liked it. So we decided that we wanted to give back in a way beyond just the building of the building. And so we all made an agreement to pick a kid or two and pay their schooling through high school, basically, which we did. And that felt good to do that. They had no concept of the economy over in America. They basically had like when we got ready to leave, they were like, can I have your watch? Can I have this? Can I have that? Right? As if it grows on trees over here and everybody's wealthy. But in retrospect, the truth is we all are incredibly wealthy here compared to what they were doing, how they were there. But okay, so we're doing all that stuff. We're hanging out. And I'm really getting to know these people. And interestingly enough, I start to really see the difference between African Americans and Africans. The Africans there treated me without any of the suspicion or wariness or contempt or all the various other types of ways that I've been treated by African Americans because of our cultural history here and slavery and civil rights movement and you know, white privilege and all these other things. You know, there was a lot of discord between African Americans and white Americans, and none of that was present with the Africans because they had none of that context. They just treated me like another dude. I mean, a white dude with red hair, which was weird enough, right? But I mean, once we got beyond that to whatever degree, there was none of that hostility that existed. And in fact, the only person that I got into any kind of conflict with was Nigel, this pot-smoking union organizer who at first I got along with great because he did have that context, and we would speak to each other in ways that were problematic. When the frustration would ratchet up, when the tensions would rise, we almost got into a fist fight. And I thought it was really interesting, that difference, and it was sad to me because it really caused me to see what a lot of white folks don't see is just the underlying chasm that exists between us in this country that doesn't need to be there. If it hadn't been for 500 years of demonic slavery at the hands of people who look like me. So that was an interesting part of the experience. Another interesting part of the experience, we go into one of the coastal communities. So there's a couple little villages on the coast of Gambia, which has pristine coastline. And apparently those are vacation spots for Europeans. They like to go there to these little coastal resorts, basically. And we'd been in the jungle for a while, and we were stinky, and it was, you know, we were missing the comforts of home and Western civilization. And so we ended up taking a weekend and going into this resort town. And I decided I wanted to get some weed. And so I bought some weed from one of these guys on the beach. And I noticed somebody was following me around, this guy with a kind of like this fatter, black, older guy with like a pork pie hat and kind of dressed nicely and stuff. I'm like, what's going on here? And then one of my counterparts comes up to me and says, did you buy, I wish I could do the accent, but basically asked me if I bought weed. I said, yeah. He says, you need to dump that right now. That guy's a cop and he's going to pen your ass. And so I made a beeline to the nearest bathroom, dumped all the weed that I just bought. And it occurred to me later, of course, this is one of those places, the tourist trap. They will get your ass. They'll try to sell you weed, and then they will put you in jail and extort money out of your family, like jailed abroad. You know, a horror story that I could have been a part of there if I hadn't hipped up to that whole thing. So, in any case, we do all this stuff, and it's amazing, and I'm really starting to get along and enjoy my time there. I'm learning so much. And then one night we're getting ready to go to bed, and we hear what, first off, the national, there was one radio station in Gambia, okay? It was the national radio station. That was the radio station, right? And so I spent a lot of time listening to that at night. All of a sudden it went off the air, and it was just static. And that hadn't happened in the 2 months or so that we'd been there. Didn't really think much of it, though, necessarily. And then we start hearing what sounded like explosions or like pops off in the distance. And then we start hearing a lot of it, way off in the distance, but definitely. But it sounded like some serious shit going on. And then we saw some helicopters a little while later. Had no idea what was actually happening. And sometime the next morning, the radio comes back on. Guess what? What had been the most stable government in West Africa for 30-something years since British decolonialization in the 60s, they'd had the same president for that entire time, so democratically elected, supposedly. All of that 30 years of history and democratically elected president and all that ends with a military coup right in the middle of the time that I'm staying there. A 23-year-old colonel who incidentally had been educated at West Point, which I thought was odd, overthrows the government and takes control of Gambia. There was some fighting in the capital city, which is what we were hearing. And there were some rebels entrenched that was still sort of active and going on. But the president managed to escape within 12 hours of the beginning of this whole thing, managed to escape onto the U.S. naval ship that just so happened to be not that far off the coast for him to escape to. And I have often wondered how much the U.S. had to do with that, because here you've got a colonel who has been educated in the U.S., and you also have a naval ship ready to escort the old president, who was probably never going to leave, to Senegal, where he can live out his days, right? It's a carrot stick thing. And so consequently, the borders are shut, the borders are closed, the embassy is closed, we are trapped inside Gambia. It was on the CBS Evening News here in America. My parents were flipped out, all the phone lines were down, cell phones weren't really a thing. We had one cell phone that was kind of a new thing, and our group leader had it, and they couldn't call out, even with that. And we had no idea what was going to happen. And so now there's checkpoints between villages. The 23-year-old colonel eventually gets on and says, everybody's going to be safe. We're just going to keep the borders closed for a while, but don't trip out for all of you people who are in this country from elsewhere. And okay, so we start going out to Banjul, which is one of the, or no, Banjul was the capital. There's another, I wish I could remember the name of the city. There was a closer big city, which is where the nearest market was. It was about an hour and a half away or an hour away from the village we were in. And we needed to go there to get supplies and stuff. And so we went there. And on our way back, there's a checkpoint. And at that checkpoint, the first off, we had started in the village making friends with some of the soldiers who were part of this military coup because they came from our village. And they were some of the guys I was smoking weed with that first night when I was there. And you'll see a picture of them, right? So thank God we know those guys. But at the same time, this is a political thing that's going on. So we're coming back to our village from the place where we buy our food, and there's a checkpoint, and it's those two guys that are at that checkpoint, or one of them was at that checkpoint, and somebody else we don't know. And they get on this bus, which was a legitimate bus at this point, or like a minivan or something. It was more legitimate, or actually it was a double-decker thing. We were on the top deck, so it was like a mini bus with a top seating. And they walk through the crowd with their guns and their bayonets. They come up to Luke and Patty and say, you basically say, "You guys are from West Point, huh?" Luke and Patty are like, "Yeah." And they say, "We need you to get off the bus." And everybody's heart dropped in that moment. It was legit. And there was this moment where you could tell that depending on how they responded would dictate what happened next. Were these guys serious? Were they testing them? What was going on? And it could have been touch or go. And Luke played it well, since he knew the guy that was asking him, although the guy that was asking him was like with this totally dead serious look on his face. Luke played it off as a joke, as if like, "Man, you got me." Like, you kind of the vibe of, "Man, you're intimidating, but you really got my heart started. But thank God I know you." Gosh, you know, and slowly but surely that guy broke into a smile and they let us go. But I'm not convinced that was the plan. I think there's quite a possibility that maybe they wouldn't have let us go if they'd responded differently. There were times then when we would be in that, you know, the markets and such, that I remember one time in particular, one of the kids whose education I ended up paying, we're in a market and it was still touch and go for several weeks. And he heard the sound of military vehicles racing down the street. He pushed me under like a basket or something, or like a table, so that I wouldn't be seen, because he didn't know if they were going to fuck with me or not. And sure enough, it was one of these cars with one of those big 50 caliber, you know, gun turrets on the back with a guy standing up, right? So it was really nerve-wracking. We didn't know what was going to happen. We didn't know if Luke and Patty were a blessing or a liability. And lo and behold, eventually the borders opened, thank God. About a month later, we were kept over by several weeks from the time that we were supposed to return. You know, so eventually the borders open again. During this time, there was a female circumcision ceremony also, which is a brutal practice, but it was also a huge pageantry. The males and the females of age who were getting ready to become men and women, 12, 13, you know, that type of age, would go off with the elders of the region, because this is a regional thing. So it wasn't just our village, it was all the several villages that we were building that building for. And then the women would go off with, or the girls would go off with the elder women, and they would go off into the jungle, God knows when. They'd be gone for they were gone for weeks. During that time that they were gone, there was also spirits that swept through the villages with and I still don't know what the sounds were, but this whoa, 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 unearthly sound. And we were like all so curious about what that was, but the villagers were all like, "Don't fucking look out the door." And they were dead serious. They were scared for us, because we were like, "What is this? I gotta see." They're like, "No, dead, don't do it. People have died." Like I tried to actually just be like, "Okay, I'm gonna go anyway." And my compatriot got visibly almost tearful, like scared, shaking, pleading, saying, "Don't, that bad things would happen to me if I went out there, that these were the spirits of their elders and ancestors." And there was a whole thing about hungry ghosts or something. I don't remember the story, but that bad things would happen. And so these unearthly sounds swept through the village that night. I will never know what those sounds were. I couldn't identify what could make a sound like that. And I'm still super curious to this day about it. But it was really intense and really interesting, and just a picture of how they maintained their cultural identity and the seriousness and reverence which they had for their ancestors. And it was really amazing. And then when the elders had apparently, when the youngins were sufficiently whatever, they went through their trials and tribulations and their rites of passage, which is something we need in this country, are rites of passage, although not brutal ones like the ones the young women had to go through. But they would all come out, and the drummers went through all the villages and gathered everybody out. And you'll see pictures of that too. And the pageantry and the colors, and it was such a celebration. And the young people were all cloistered in these brown cloths. And when we all got to the one village in the village center, it was everybody around, and one by one, the young people would be called out to dance, and they would throw off the garment, and they'd have all these bright colors on underneath, and they would do their own dance. Each of them had their own like way of expressing themselves through dance, as the drummers like got the fuck down. And it was beautiful. It was really beautiful, and the entire community would celebrate them and welcome them into adulthood, basically, even though some of these kids look too young to be adults to me, but regardless, that's my cultural bias. And it was amazing, and it was beautiful. It was also controversial and brutal, and not right with the female circumcision stuff, which you can look up on your own if you wish. But the cultural community, all coming together and accepting you, and you are now officially accepted, is something really lacking in this society, I think. So eventually the borders opened, and we were able to go and get out. We left Gambia and went to Senegal, and we stayed in like a proper like guest cottage at this point that had like all the night, it had like running water and a shower, and it was all this stuff. And while we were there, we went and saw Isle de Gore, which was a really hugely powerful experience. Isle de Gore is an island off of Dakar, and the triangle trade with the slavery trade, the slave trade. There was Africa, then there was the Caribbean, then there was the United States, right? And this was sort of the triangle that the slave trade would traverse. And slaves from all over Africa would be brought to the Isle de Gore, and housed there in small little places, ripped away from their families, not sure what's going on, housed with people from other parts of Africa who did not speak the same tribal language. In Gambia alone, there were 5 tribal languages. And they were scared and petrified and had no idea what was going to happen. They were being brutalized and beaten and raped, and horrors being perpetrated upon them, until the slave ship would come. And you could pack them tight or pack them loose. If you packed them tight, you literally just packed Africans head to toe, head to toe, head to toe for the whole trip, and with the understanding that you're going to lose to death a fair number of those, but you still packed enough in that you're going to make a profit. If you pack it loose, you're not going to lose as many, but you're not going to make as much money either, because you don't bring as many, right? And we got to see the shackles that they would be held in, and we got to see the corridor that they would walk down this plank onto that ship that would take them away from anything they ever knew, not only for the rest of their lives, but for the lives of every single one of their spawn, their children, grandchildren, great-great-grandchildren, ad infinitum, down through the ranks until you had a Nigel or any other African-American who got here through the slave trade. And the pain and brutality of that experience, and seeing how that affected the African-Americans in my group and how it affected me, was just really profound. And I'm really grateful that I was able to see that. And it's something worth remembering. The cultural things we experience right now, if there's still, like I assume there will be, discord racially when you are of age, just always try to remember that comes from somewhere. There's still a lot of work to heal. 500 years of brutality. So we did that, and then we kind of hung out in Dakar for a few days until our flight was ready. And on the last night that we were there, we decided to finally go out and have like a nice 5-star meal, right? And I've been told before I went there, don't drink the water in the village, you know, take your iodine tablets, you're gonna get sick, you gotta be careful what you eat. And I started, at first I took the iodine tablets when I got to the village, but after a while I weaned myself off of those. I didn't use the iodine tablets, I just drank the village water, ate the food, didn't get sick, never got sick. We go to a 5-star super hotel, you know, hoity-toity restaurant in Dakar the night before we leave and have like this really good, delicious dinner. Chicken. Great, everything's great. Getting ready to get on the plane, 5 o'clock the next morning. I'm in line. There is a thunder down under. There is a rumbling, which is not fun, going on in me as I get ready to board this flight. And it just gets worse and worse. And I'm dropping sweat, and I feel like I'm going to puke and shit. As soon as we were given the go-ahead, we took off, and as soon as I got the go-ahead to get up, I was in that toilet more than I wasn't. I spent the entirety of that 14-hour flight over the Atlantic back to America shitting and puking my guts out in the toilet. And when I got back, I was so bad just from that 14 hours. I became so emaciated from that 14 hours flight that my parents who picked me up took me to the nearest hospital where they, first off, told me I had salmonella, which was great. And secondly, had to pump me full of fluids to replenish all the fluids that I'd lost. And that is how I ended my African trip. And it was the best thing I ever could have done. All of it, even the salmonella. Fuck it. I was in a military coup. Who can say that? Who can say, I mean, look, I've done a lot of stuff in my life, and I'm really happy to have done it all. I mean, from being an undercover informant to being in a military coup in West Africa. I mean, I feel grateful. And I want you to always grab the experiences you want, okay? Don't be stupid. Don't be stupid. That's one thing, you know. I didn't go and get myself up in, you know, I played it smart. That's why I wore my money around my neck and not in my back pocket, right? I tried to have situational awareness, you know, tried not to be foolish in the risks. Although I've taken foolish risks, I just would be nice if you didn't. But definitely never shy away from your dreams or the things you want to do. Grab it. Go for it, man. Go for it. You live once. And it's all about writing that balance between having a rich and full life and a safe life. And there's a balance to be had, and it ebbs and flows. But for certain, grab your dreams, take the adventures, do the things, do them. Say fuck it. Grab your nuts and hop up and say fuck it and do it. There's nothing you can't do if you decide. I know people that take a trip every single year or every couple years for 3 months into all over the world. And they're not rich. They're just workaday people, but they save and they plan and they do it. And they have adventures. And so see the world if you can, little man. Okay. That's it for now. This was a long one. I love you. I got to go home and go to bed. It's almost midnight. I love you, Peter. I love you deeply and forever. I hope I am worthy of how magical and wonderful you are. I love you, buddy. Okay, till next.
Disease slowly wafts over me, all around the perfumes of poverty. Choking souls on bed sand. This ray pirate dust can't soothe the bloated bellies of a people starved by time, fate, and hate. But wait, soon I'm shown the price I could never take. Thus my great quest begins, and a life that ain't grown, not shots again, baptized. The love, hope, and healing, keep the fires breathing, revealing the sweet communion of humans being. Oh, so free. I'm on the outside looking in at this goddamn Eden. The hatred of centuries reflected back at me like an magnified sunbeam. Try as I might, tensions drawn too tight, too taut, the binding knot of our past. Can't bear this hatred I've inherited. So I stand in on a branch, the chance. But it's the twist which slices me till I bleed.